Great. Good evening, everyone. I welcome you all to another episode of Table Talk, a series of conversations with academics and writers who work and write on animals. We're the Indian Animal Studies Collective. I'm Susan, and my co host Anu is also here. We aim to bring together researchers and writers who are working on human animal relations in India. Today we have with us Sophie Esch, and we're going to discuss her essay on the animal turn in Latin American studies. Sophie, I thought we could start the discussion by talking about your essay and what it's trying to do. And, right in the introduction, you say that I have to say about the essay that it's animal studies in Latin America is very entangled. And that's a word that, we've been discussing so much in all of these episodes. So could you tell us and start off about the essay with that?
Yes, first of all, thanks so much for having me. It's a true pleasure. I love the work that you're doing, and I'm really excited about being in conversation with all of you. And yes, I think that's really the starting point of my essay is the saying that this essay is trying to disentangle the utterly entangled, trying to kind of um, find the genealogies that inform the animal turn in Latin America and kind of tear them apart a little bit and thus kind of make more sense of them because I do think there's different ways how people come to animal studies and different philosophical um, entry points. And it was an interesting process for me also when writing that article when I shared earlier versions of it. And I think at first I had started sort of with a very um, like maybe more Anglo-British way of narrating it, which is sort of through Zinger and the animal liberation movement. And then people were like, wait, this is not how I came to animal studies. Like I came to animal studies through Derrida. And that's really my entry point. And I thought I was like, this is really informative. I think also beyond Latin American studies, but in general, sort of how people come to the field. And basically, the three genealogies that I try to trace in the article is one. Um, I think the big one is ecofeminism and different moments in thought there. Um, that lead to the importance of animal studies today, and they're really Haraway, I think, in the Latin American context, is the one that's where there's most reception, where there's a lot of reading of her work. I don't think as much of the earlier ecofeminists. And then sort of the second entry point, critical theory and Derrida, Deleuze, etc., as another sort of more philosophical take on entry point to the field. And then last but not least, um, the the animal liberation movement and the more British sort of theory around that.
I also noticed, in comparison, I'm not sure about what word to use, but whenever we talk about an Indian animal studies, let's say, it's almost always in a post-colonial context, and the subaltern becomes an important word to start thinking about it.
Mm.
But in your essay, even though you're talking about the colonial legacies, you don't explicitly use that context. I mean, is that a deliberate choice on your part?
That is a really good question. I think I would say subaltern studies has a very complicated history in Latin America, where there were kind of based on the admiration caused by what subaltern studies was doing in India and South Asia. There were attempts to create Latin American subaltern studies groups as well, but they were very much located in the US and not in Latin America. So there was a big rejection against that, so that it felt like an imposition from the outside and another form of imperialism. So the term is relatively charged in that sense, intellectually. Um, so I think it really didn't occur to me, and I have not heard people talk about the animal in those subaltern terms. I think what I see more is that people approach the topic in Latin America through the topic of biopolitics, and they are kind of talk about the question of the exploitation of humans and animals, non-human animals alike. I think that is, I feel, more the entry point than the subaltern.
And just another general question, because you talk about institutional factors that have
Mhm,
kind of prevented the uptake of animal studies too. And it's a pretty new field in India, and it's often kind of subsumed under environmental studies, environmental humanities. And
mhm,
I think even within environmental humanities, there's a lot of interest in eco-criticism, let's say, but
mhm,
not so much animal studies,
mhm,
because I think of its ideological context as well. So
mhm.
is it a similar situation in Latin America as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why I feel it's so important also to defend animal studies and the animal turn and not lose that, because we I do think we have a big general collective turn to environmental questions, um, and I sometimes feel that the animal gets lost in those questions. So I was really happy. I should probably explain that the context of the article, the chapter that I wrote, is a book edited by Juan Poblete, which traces different turns in Latin American studies. And it is interesting because the book does have another chapter on the eco-critical turn and another chapter on the biopolitical turn. And I really appreciate that he was seeking somebody who would write about the animal turn too, because I do feel the while related and again entangled, I do think that animal questions are uh, particular and peculiar, and sometimes they get subsumed if we just talk about environmental issues in general. And I think what I find also really fascinating about animal studies is um, that it really invites us to consider otherness and difference in a very different way than what we're used to thinking about also in post-colonial studies, where we might think about it in terms of race and in gender, ethnicity, but really grappling with the otherness of animals is probably the thing that excites me the most, even though I feel the discourse is a lot about like the dissolution between the human and the animal, and a lot of the academic discourse or literary analysis ends there. And I'm like, I'm not sure we're there yet, because I think the interesting thing is question is really to grapple with these other creatures full of life, but that are also so different and to a degree inaccessible to us and our thinking. So yeah, I do think there the story is very very similar to what you're describing. That I think the dominant turn is the environmental turn.
I forgot to mention this in the beginning, but I see a lot of new people who've joined us. It's a conversation, so feel free to jump in at any time to ask a question or comment on whatever we're talking about. Just raise a hand and jump in. Forgot to mention this. But to get back to what you were saying, Sophie, I'm
Hmm.
always curious about the eco-critical aspect too, because it's not just trendy, but I feel like it does appeal to a lot of people to analyze literary animals. And I remember you talk about, I think, Mario Ortiz, where he's talking about how our relationship with animals themselves are literary in a way. And I've always thought that as cryptic as it sounds, kind of feel like I get what he's saying
Hmm.
intuitively. So could
Hmm.
you you talk a bit about it and what you think about this, being drawn to literary animals,
Mhm.
but kind of also resisting engaging with actual animals, which a lot of people do.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think it's a great book. It's called Literature and Animal Studies by Mario Ortiz Robles. It came out in the Routledge series on literature and contemporary thought. I should note, though, that it does not speak about Latin America at all. Like one of the criticisms actually that I have of his book, that it is very much focused on the global north and very much focused on English literature. He is an English professor, but I do very much love how he hones hones in on the specificity of what literature can tell us about animals, where maybe some people might be really dismissive of that because maybe we think of children's literature and certain depictions of animals. Um, but he says kind of that literature is actually one of the primary places where humanity reflects on our relationship with animals and really works through those complex relationships. And I love that quote about our relationships with animals being largely literary and fictional. And it makes me smile too because I think if you think about our companion animals, we make up so much stories. I mean, I live with several cats, and I feel like we've by now created, my partner and I, we've created a novel around their lives, their personalities, what they like, what they don't like, how they think about the world. Like, one we say like his philosophy is food is life, and for the other one, it's play, play, play. So and in the end, I mean, it's out of love and affection, right? But it is also, in the end, a projection of ours, right, in our relationship onto them. So, and I actually find that quite beautiful, kind of this idea of that it's our way. We are storytelling animals as humans. That is our way of approaching that otherness and kind of making sense to it. And as you, I'm not sure if we'll get to that later, but I do have sort of some qualms with sort of the big no-nos of animal studies, as I call them. And I think one is anthropomorphism, that there's always this like, oh no, anthropomorphism, that's bad. But as a literary scholar, I simply don't agree. I think it's one way of relating. And I think those are important. And in the end, as a literary scholar, in the end, I am still, even if I'm thinking about animals, I'm dealing with humans because I'm dealing with how humans think about animals via literature, right? So,
Yeah, I'm interested in this question of anthropomorphism too. And, I read Clarice Lispector a long time back, and I remember reading
mhm,
about the cockroach, I think, in one of her
mhm,
books. And the utter otherness of the cockroach it's really seriously present. But at the same time, it's also very connected to whatever is happening to the protagonist psychologically. So
yeah,
I think then the tension is the animal serving as a vehicle for the character to have some psychological insight or breakdown,
yeah,
and they are and then are we overreading by focusing or like telescoping onto the cockroach as
mhm,
some kind of an approach to otherness? And that I feel like is the real danger for all of us with literature.
mhm,
How to tackle such an accusation?
yeah. No, I think it's a great question, and I think it is complicated. And I do feel often that we have to look at each literary piece carefully and think about, is it actually fauna centric? Like, does it center the animal, or is there an animal present that is quite important to the storyline, um, but maybe really it isn't about the animal, the story. And it's not like I'm not saying that I have that clear on Clarice Lispector's text, but I think about that a lot in terms of that we can always say, since sort of my general research is also on animals and war, and war and the environment, and then sometimes people say like, well, but that's they are kind of everywhere, and I'm like, yeah, but there's a difference in terms of if you tell a war story and there's animals present, to are you actually focusing in on the actions of animals, on um, on what they're doing, what one can describe, on focused on um, mm, their tactile dimensions. I mean, there's so many different ways that you can actually really center the animal and be occupied with the animal. And I think there's a lot of ways where the animal is present, but it is really a stand-in for human social issues. And I think, of course, there with the question of objection and animality, we a lot of times I do feel that. We're closer to questions of dehumanization, which of course are always very present in post-colonial societies, right? They're sort of, and there's these class dimensions too in Clarice Lispector. So, um, and I also always does find works that are about animality less interesting, to be honest, because I do think that animality is ultimately a question about humans. I don't think animals care about animality. Do you know what I mean? So I feel, and I do think that they are few and rare in between the novels or short stories or poems that really manage to center the the animal because I think we're very self-centered species in that sense. And I think I have that criticism also a little bit in the text that ultimately I actually think literature could be doing much more. It could be more inventive and more creative in terms um, of really making sure um, to approach that otherness. But I think it's really difficult. I think also in academia we're still struggling with that. I mean, all our disciplines, anthropology, sociology, they're all about humans. So shifting that gaze and truly shifting it, I think um, is really difficult. But I don't think that anthropomorphism is the issue that does not allow that because I think it is one device that we have at hand that we can use to think about otherness and then but then it depends. Do you use that anthropomorphism then to just give an animal a human voice to think about human concerns, or do you give it a voice that actually manages to think differently about things? And that can be really also unsuccessful and cringy. Do you know what I mean? Like those attempts. So I think it is a difficult device, but it could be quite powerful. And I do feel and I do think there's more scholars pushing against that kind of rejection of anthropomorphisms, precisely from literary and studies and from art history. But I do think um, the sorry, I lost my train of thought. Sorry. Next question. Anu.
Sure, go ahead.
Thanks, Sophie, because this is something that we have collectively and individually been thinking a lot about
Mhm.
anthropomorphism. And, what you had mentioned about it being a strict no-no, we are
Mhm.
also really happy, thrilled actually to see that that no-no is becoming a little less severe as time
Yeah.
passes. And there is ever more scholarship that engages with why it is something that can be a very productive way of approaching non-human otherness and trying to to sort of build a bridge to the other side, to approach,
Mm-hmm.
to speak about, to narrate. I was just thinking about some work that I have been doing in which I've been thinking about the idea of anthropomorphism as a strategy in
Mm-hmm.
exactly this sort of a project. And I've been working on these animal portraits that an Indian writer a long time back wrote of, various animals that shared her home with her, rescue animals largely. And she
Mm-hmm.
follows this track really in all of these portraits. So it's kind of like ticking a lot of the right boxes. She
Mm-hmm.
describes the physicality of the animal with great detail. So, it
Mm-hmm.
is clearly not like a metaphorical animal, it is a very real animal. And then she sort of poeticizes the physicality of the animal by using metaphors that connect it to, features of the animal, to things for which she already has a vocabulary. So
Mm-hmm.
it is like
Mm-hmm.
this step-by-step process. And then when she anthropomorphizes, it feels like something that flows really smoothly, and it feels like a part of a project to, sort of make sense of the other, to coexist, to understand, to approach. So we are fans of anthropomorphism, really. Um, I had a couple of questions for you. Um,
Yeah.
One thing that I really liked is your discussion of bicho or bichito, and I like the
Uh-huh.
fact that you put these two terms together, and tekwani, and your discussion on these terms points, of course, to how indigenous and vernacular epistemologies are important. And I was interested in knowing how Latin American animal studies, as a field that has taken some time to catch on but is on its way now,
Mm-hmm.
meaningfully integrate indigenous languages and ontologies without sort of appropriating them or flattening their specificity. But secondly,
Mm-hmm.
also, how might, if we can talk about a linguistic turn within animal studies at all, um, how might such a linguistic turn change the kind of animals or even, bichos, as you call them,
Mm-hmm.
that become thinkable or, approachable or legible then in scholarship?
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think those are fascinating questions, and I'm not sure that the field has answers yet to these questions, because it's so much at the beginning, and I do feel um, going back to the question of entanglements, that there is the power of the Academy of the Global North, that a lot of the language that is being used comes ultimately from the Anglo realm and gets translated. And and I think it's interesting. I think, for example, a couple of years back, I wrote an article in English, which was where I used the term non-human animals, and the editor of the article was a novelist from Latin America, and he's like, "What does that even mean?" He was very critical of this sort of this language that feels very jargony. And I was like, well, trying to signal, etc., that humans are also animals, and this is the reason. But I understood his concern in terms of language, like the non-human animal. I mean, it is very jargony, um, and but I see it now also being used in Spanish como animal no humano. So like it has traveled and is being used. And I think the bicho is sort of one way of also really my attempt to kind of try to diversify the language and think differently about that, because there is this beautiful term which is bicho in Spanish, which and bichito, which the diminutive in Spanish always makes things cuter, smaller, littler, etc. And it can mean a lot of things. Like it can be both negative and positive. It's sort of from beast to critter. It kind of encompasses everything. Um, and but it is really kind of just as an idea of, can we do something different where we find a language in Spanish, and it did. And then after I wrote that, I became more familiar. Let me see if I can find something quickly to show you um, with the um, to show you um, these images from, if I can share real quick, from a Brazilian artist, Ligia Clark, who actually in the 60s, I believe, started to create these bichos. She called them bichos. And they're really interesting pieces because they're meant to be manipulated by the audience. And they change, their shape changes according to how you manipulate them. And the idea is kind of that they become alive in the moment that they're being um, manipulated. And I'll stop sharing. I just wanted to show them real quick. And I realized that some other art historians also picked up on the idea of the Bicho studies and liked it. And I had a colleague who presented an artist work from artists in Panama where it had these hands that looked like spiders walking through up and down the trees. And she was like, these are bichos, is that the term to kind of talk about these other creatures that that are alive but don't quite fit a certain category. So that in terms of the Bicho, in terms of indigenous languages, I don't think that so far any of the terminology is being used. I mentioned the Tequani as sort of just saying there's different ways of categorizing living beings in different languages, and what would it mean to think differently about that? But it's not. There is no active use of any specific indigenous terms, which of course also has to do with the enormous heterogeneity and diversity once it comes to indigenous languages and indigenous cultures across Latin America. That I think it would be hard for one language or one term to become dominant in that sense because you have such diversity. One term, to just give an example, maybe one of the only indigenous terms other than the ones that have traveled into the Spanish language over colonialism, of which there are, of course, many, many. Um, Abya Yala is one of the few terms that is used in Latin American studies rather consistently. And Abya Yala is one way to refer to the Americas with an indigenous term, sort of a term that is not a colonial term and doesn't have the colonial baggage. And it is a term used by the Guna people, who are indigenous people who live off the islands and the ocean in Panama, and that's the term of how they refer to the mainland. And in North America, for example, sometimes Turtle Island is used, but Abya Yala is sort of one of the terms that has flown into the mainstream, but it's relatively rare. And I also would think most people don't know much about the Guna people because it's a very specific ethnicity from a very specific context. So um, I see issues there in terms of translation. I think the big thing that has happened, and that really is the work of Eduardo G. Castro, the idea of perspectivism, sort of so that more than indigenous terms, indigenous epistemologies are flowing into the field and changing that, which is, of course, quite powerful. And I think perspectivism is sort of one of the key ideas changing the field, and the other probably the question of the rights of nature. That's the two things that I see happening in Latin America.
Thank you. And then I had a what if kind of question as well, if you will humor me. Um, because in your chapter, you foreground ecofeminism as a foundational but also often overlooked genealogy of animal studies. And I wanted to
Mhm.
ask you, how do you think would the field look different today if ecofeminist contributions had been centered rather
Mhm.
than marginalized as they were in the early consolidation of the animal turn?
That is a great question. I'm gonna try to give an answer, but I'd love to hear your answer too. Like, because I think it is a really interesting question. And I think it comes from me also for that my attempt in the chapter to foreground ecofeminism comes also, I think, from an own learning process that we discussed some older ecofeminist works in a feminist research group here at Rice, at my home institution. And there were also a lot of feminist and gender scholars who were like, yeah, that was kind of so um, such a strange current that we reject. So also they talked about their own rejection of ecofeminism. And we read some sort of more recent texts where like, hey, we by ecofeminists saying like, hey, we made all these claims that now everybody's presenting as something new 15, 20 years ago. And then for me it was kind of um important, I think, to trace the current to Dora Haraway, which I think sometimes people don't discuss her as an ecofeminist because she's, you know, discussed in science and technology studies as a philosopher, et cetera, et cetera. But I think one can sort of, there is a clear genealogy that one can trace. And so there is, I think, maybe somewhat of a late revenge in terms of that she's so uber important, I think, in the field now. I think she's sort of the crucial reference also that people outside of the field will know and read and reference. In terms of how the field would look differently, um, I would say that probably less attention and less time would have been spent on questions of post-humanism and sort of the very theoretical and very conceptual questions, which I think sometimes are more mental games and plays than kind of really centering the animal or centering the suffering or centering care. That would be my polemic answer to that. A little bit of a dig against posthumanism. But
I'm
I'd be
glad you
curious to hear
answered
you.
with this. This is something that I have been, and a lot of us probably have been thinking about, this what if game, as I call it, of uh, because one has avidly followed the way the discourse has developed, and it's interesting to imagine how it would have developed if the foundational ideas hadn't been grounded with the scholars that one has focused on all of this time, and on the others who got sort of marginalized but are being rediscovered, or as you said, whose genealogy is being traced back to their ecofeminist roots, although it had long been forgotten. But I'm glad you brought up post-humanism, because I kind of wanted to ask you something about that as well.
Mhm.
Because
Yeah.
you've also mentioned how the animal turn, of course, overlaps with post-humanism, but it has
Mhm.
its own sort of its own concerns, its own very distinct concerns. Would you
Mhm.
say that there is, or there are still some productive tensions between the animal turn and post-humanist thought or theory? Um, and where would they be located?
Mhm.
Especially as far as questions of, let's say, agency are concerned, or materiality.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, I think again, great question. I do think that I do still think that there's quite a bit of tension if one is really concerned with animal studies, which I do feel is very much at the margin of those questions. I mean, sort of, and I find that somewhat surprising, both with posthumanism, but also a lot of the work that works on biopolitics. My sense is often that even though the animal is mentioned, it's there and it like, but I feel like that it's as a field it constantly loses the animal, and it always is thrown back to let's talk about the human condition, which is then tied up with other issues. But um, I I do think that post-humanism and also a lot of the work on biopolitics, I find it too human-centered still in its approach. And I do think animal studies, if it's bold enough and can claim enough space, I think it can bring us further in terms of, again, engaging with that true otherness and that unknowability also of animals, but that are clearly live, that are clearly creatures. So I mean, I think we no longer need to have the discussion on sentience, for example, but really sort of the question of how do we live together, how do we engage, and there I find then I think like I feel my own path is then more animal studies and multi-species studies as sort of as a productive way of thinking about those things, and thus also environmental humanities, right? I mean, going back to Susan's questions before, I mean, it's not that I have a problem with environmental humanities. I think it's actually we do have to be able to think these together. But I think in that context, we always have to make sure that the animal does not get lost. But yeah, I think that's where I feel there is um, a very sort of productive path to take, which is maybe more concerned with conviviality and which sounds more jargony in English actually than in Spanish, because in Spanish it's convivencia, so it's about living together. How do we live together? Which I think centers other questions than just being focused on animality and exploitation, etc., which are important criticisms, but I think um, they become repetitive after a while and don't are not as productive over time.
It's also interesting to see how, the same set of people get used as theory in the discipline in such different places too. And and I was thinking about anthropomorphism, and like first there was all this attempt in animal studies academia to kind of say and recuperate its reputation almost and say, okay, it's not bad. And then
Hmm.
often there is this, I always think about people comparing, I think, Rilke's panther with somebody like Ted Hughes's panther. And then
Hmm.
when Rilke is doing this, he's not paying attention. I'm not sure right now, but one of them is focusing on the psychological, whereas the other focuses on the animal body, and
Hmm.
that is the truer representation of the animal. So if we are to think that way, do you think that, since I think we can safely say that all of us um, in proper animal studies academia probably agree that anthropomorphism is good, then
Hmm.
I think we are unwittingly also endorsing a correct anthropomorphism, which
Hmm.
is based on the animal body or the sensorial as
Hmm.
the true representation and not anything human based.
Yeah. No, that's a really good point. I think that's a really interesting question, and I do think, I mean, it is interesting to just also just trace how academia moves, because going back to where I lost my train of thought before was precisely the point that my sense is with that sort of very early rejection of anthropomorphism within the humanities, I feel it just adopted a point of view of the sciences very uncritically, and which also I think sciences not necessarily maintain as strongly these days. But it was like this taboo from the sciences, like, no, we can't do that. And as a humanist, I'm like, of course we can. And there I would say, I mean, it's not something we do that much anymore with going back to your question, Susan, as literary scholars, but as a literary critic, I would say probably there I would distinguish. I would not say like there's one that anthropomorphism per se is good. Um, I think it's more that anthropomorphism per se is not bad, but then there's a range in terms of what what anthropomorphism can do and cannot do, and what it does well or doesn't do well in specific contexts. And there I would maybe then go back to more our profession of critics and analyze why do I find certain anthropomorphism cringy, whereas others I find endearing or funny. Do you know what I mean? And I'm thinking like about the criticism about White Bone, which is this novel by a Canadian author on elephant herds in Africa, which has a very elaborate way of describing them. And I think if I remember, it's in post-colonial eco-criticism. There's a very strong critique of the novel, and that it just doesn't work. Sort of is basically the idea. Um, and I do think as literary scholars, the interesting question is like, why does something work or not work, or why do we find it doesn't work? And I don't think there's many successful examples of anthropomorphism done well and adding something. So I'm very curious, Anu, about the author you mentioned, because it just sounds like such an interesting um, approach. Um, so I think it's also not that I'm advocating for like this is all good, but that it shouldn't be, we shouldn't work with the taboo, because I think the taboo leads to too simple academic arguments. And that's where I want us in animal studies also to be better. Do you know what I mean? And to be a kind of um, to develop specific arguments for specific things. And I'm thinking here, for example, and it's not that I have thought about it or written about it, but there's a novel by Alain Mabankou, a Congolese author, called Memoirs of a Porcupine. And the porcupine is a negative double of a human, and together they commit crimes in the novel. And the novel is sort of the confession of the porcupine. And it's a hilarious novel. I'm not sure that it does much in terms of us understanding porcupines, right? In terms of centering the animal in that sensory way, even though there's a few descriptions which I find very endearing, which is sort of about shuffling and how to describe how they're walking, etc. Um, but it's a very funny novel. I like it. Do you know what I mean? Like it's not the sense of like, this feels like it's creating something just for a specific effect. So I think there's a lot of work that could still be done also in terms of animal narrators, which is not the same as anthropomorphism per se, but like w- what makes for a successful animal narrator that is that works for different kinds of readers, etc. And what would that mean?
I think related to this question is also how we would define animal subjectivity, which is also something we've
Mhm,
been talking about in a lot of these episodes, which is that, even when I talk to other people about it, it's what is animal subjectivity? Do we define it in terms of human subjectivity? Human, like for humans, opinions, dreams, beliefs, or is
mhm,
it something else that has to be always defined, at least quasi-scientifically, in terms of even if there are animal cultures, then it's always related to animal behaviors and so on. And I
mhm,
think I remember reading a Goodreads review of this elephant book, and people being really divided on how they felt about it. Some people thought this didn't work at all while imagining the elephant
mhm,
mind, whereas some people thought that it did. So if it is supposed to work, then it has to be connected to uh, humans, or what we would recognize as human subjectivity, whereas
mhm,
people rejected it because it was too other,
mhm,
uh,
mhm, mhm,
too alien. So then, just would like to hear your thoughts on this,
mhm.
about animal subjectivity. And I'm also thinking about somebody like Octavia Butler, who
Hmm.
does manage to talk about this really non-human subjectivity, but that's not really the animal, it's the alien or the really
Hmm.
foreign animal.
Yeah.
Yes, I was curious
Yeah.
about.
No, absolutely. I think great questions and mm, I do think that it is just like how the Anthropocene, I think, is posing a challenge to us academically to think differently and change our frameworks. I do think engaging with the non-human world in a meaningful manner mm, is a challenging task, and I'm not sure how many artists or how many writers have achieved that in a sort of successful way, or whether there also literature needs to evolve further, or maybe also gets to its limits in many ways. I sometimes think sort of how precisely thinking about sort of contemporary concerns, where I sometimes think, is art actually more successful in addressing this because it has more materials at hand in terms of representation, in terms of touch, in terms of sound, right? Like the text also kind of um, limits the possibilities of what you can do, and you're limited by the limits of what language can do, and some of that doesn't translate well. This trying to represent otherness, and so. And I think, and maybe in that sense, also thinking about Octavia Butler is there is a reason why there is such strong interest in these days in speculative fiction and science fiction, because um, I think we want to explore further than where a lot of the more realist literature leaves us, and yeah, but it is, I think, maybe also really the question of the limits of text. And I see Laura has a question
Yeah.
or comment. Laura, we can't hear you.
No, we can't.
No, we can't. Maybe you want to type your comment or question in the chat.
Okay, while we wait for that question to appear, I also wanted to go back, because you're almost out of time, to the really interesting statement you made about animality
Hmm.
and about how you think that's more related to humans than to animals. And I think uh, it makes sense to me too, because animality as linked to dehumanization is often the way that people talk about the usefulness of animal studies sometimes, but
Hmm.
obviously that's not what the otherness of the animal is supposed to be about. But what do you think about where are we supposed to then uh, kind of have solidarity with other academics or activists from other, let's say, fields, if we are to not think that, right? Because there's so much emphasis also on shared vulnerability, shared finitude, and so on. So while I agree with you, I want to know if I'm missing out on something
Hmm.
with the animality animal connection, because the animality is also, in a way, it's not the essence of the animal, perhaps, but it is also what is the essence, right?
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that that's a really important question, and especially for scholars like us who are working in post-colonial contexts, I think it can never go away because that question of dehumanization, um, animalization, etc., is so intrinsic also to the workings of colonialism and its legacy. So I think it isn't meant to say we shouldn't think about that or have that as part of the of the conversation, but just kind of to be aware that once the conversation turns to this again, then we're generally not talking about the animal anymore, but we're talking about the human. That it's just sort of in terms of the directionality of the conversation. And I do think the challenge is to find a language that allows us to talk about um, social injustices, environmental injustices, interspecies injustices in a way that acknowledges all of these. And I mean, I do feel um, multi-species justice says that that's what they want to do and that's what they're heading, but I'm like, yeah, but that's really hard. So like I feel like multi-species justice, there is kind of the utopian concept that tries to bring, let's say, animal liberation and struggles for human liberation together. I'm gonna sort of, this is like formulating it very broadly, but um, and I think it's interesting in its proposal, but I'm not sure we're there yet in terms of really conceptualizing that and having societies willing to think that way. Do you know what I mean? That's what what I think. So, but multi-species justice might be one of the answers. And the other thing that I really like going again back to multi-species studies is I think there's this idea by Anna Tsing, of practicing the arts of attentiveness. And I really, really like that quote and that idea. I was also kind of going back to your questions of anthropomorphism, because I think anthropomorphism that is well done you know, um, is one that practices these arts of attentiveness, of really taking in the other and paying attention. Um, and that already makes a difference. That paying attention, I think, makes a difference because um, then there is a bigger materiality, actuality to a creature. And it is not just a symbol, a stand-in. Okay, so I think Lauda has written her um, question. She's asking for the indigenous sources that sometimes are very complicated to have. Do you have an idea how to found how indigenous people think about the animals, especially if they're imported, like the horses or cats? Um, yeah, great question. I think the the text that the big book that I recommend there that just came out last year is Marcy Norton's The Tame and the Wild, Animals After 1492. It's a fantastic book which traces really how relations between humans and animals changed in the context of the cultural context of the Americas and Europe. And it's not simply all these animals got imported to the Americas and changed everything there. There's several works on that. And I mentioned some of them in the article, Lauda. If you have access to the article, there's one book called The Plague of Sheep, which is sort of about how sheep changed the landscape in the Americas. But but her book also traces how animal relationships that indigenous people had in the Americas changed animal relationships in Europe. And I think one of her most fascinating hypotheses is that the idea of pet, of having an animal be considered kin and being considered part of the family, that might actually be an idea um, that came from the Americas and traveled from the Americas and changed European relations to animals that didn't have a conception at that time before. Because medieval times you had maybe animals as working animals, as servants or as vassals. So the falcons, for example, but they weren't considered part of the family. Whereas indigenous people had very strong domestication principles and had a lot of tame parrots, for example, and that changed animal relations. So I highly recommend Marcy Norton for that. I think in my article I also mentioned one book about one article that's really fascinating about how cattle changed the Mexican landscape in the 16th century and how there started to be these beliefs that cows disappear humans because suddenly there would be cows and cows everywhere but less humans and so I think that's really interesting and that's really sort of thinking about colonial times which is always also difficult to access. I mean, a lot of that is based on codices. So the drawings that indigenous people did pre and post conquest. So they're already transcultural productions, right? So it's never that we can access indigenous pure or the idea of pure indigenous thought pre-conquest. That's really not accessible and probably would be a construct also. But a lot of when we're thinking about indigenous thought, it's always already in contact with Western worlds. And then maybe if you're interested in just more recent works, I would recommend that's not specifically about animals, but about indigenous, contemporary indigenous conceptions in the Amazon. There's a book called The Falling Sky, which is a very extensive work, anthropological work between an anthropologist and a shaman from the Amazon that talks very much about uh, indigenous concepts and where the environment is a big topic. So those would be my go-to sources from the get-go. But I wanted to invite, I know we're almost out of time, but I just wanted to kind of open up. Oscar, I see you also here for the first time. We know each other virtually, and now we see each other virtually, but in person, so to speak. If anybody else had any comments or questions on the conversation, it was so interesting. So maybe other people also want to chime in on how they're thinking about questions of animality, anthropomorphism, etc.
Yeah, please, you can just unmute yourself and ask or speak.
Maybe I'll
Hi,
mention.
yeah, yeah,
Yes, go ahead, Oscar.
yeah. I was thank you for the talk, Sophie, for the organization. And I'm very interested in this conflict now between the focus on animality as well, the animalization, and personally, I work with literature from the 50s and the 60s, and yes, and something that I feel now in my readings and in my literary analysis helps me to go a bit out of that is focusing more on the depiction of the relationship no, between
Mhm.
humans and animals in the literary work rather than on other, yes, literary strategies. No, getting more exactly focusing more on the human animal relationship and how the relationship is depicted, and this helps me. I feel yes, too, and I think there is something interesting there
Mhm.
in the relationship rather than yeah. It helps me to go out a bit from the focus on the animality. I don't know if I made
Mhm.
myself clear and what you if you think something about that.
No, absolutely. I mean, I agree. And I think Marcy Norton also has this idea in her book, and some of her articles are available online as well, of talking about the modes of interaction between humans and animals. And I also found that very useful in terms of um, it is hard to focus center on the animal. and not all literature does that successfully, but literature will tell us a lot about human-animal relationships, and that can by itself be really interesting to analyze that. So I agree, and I think when we're looking at modes of interaction, we don't lose the animal because it is part of the equation, you know. It can, of course, be then that it's only about critique of industrial meat production, etc. I agree with you there, Oscar.
All right, that brings us to the end of this episode. Oh, we have one more question. Could you just take that too, Sophie?
Mhm. And yeah, so Jin asks if they're curious if the animal in Latin America engages non-human animals that are not mammals, for example, aquatic animals or insects that are further from the evolutionary tree from us and harder for people to do multi-species ethnography with. Yeah, I think that is a great question. I do think that of course in a lot of production there, literary production, the big mammals, big furry mammals will come first, or the charismatic megafauna. I think that tendency is definitely there. Um, and but the insects, I do feel there's quite a bit and interesting things happening. And also, just as Oscar mentioned, a lot of sort of it is not all contemporary work, but it is actually like our scholarly interest maybe in animals is renewed right now, but there has been a literary interest that is quite old and enduring. And like just to give an example, there's a novel from the 50s in Mexico that is about a man who figures out how to have conversations with mosquitoes via a flute, and then finds out that the mosquitoes are the true uh, owners of the earth, and they have a stockpile of pathogens that can wipe out humanity within a second. You know, this is like a novel from the 50s. So I do think there's interesting things there. Um, and I'm thinking also, I'm not sure how much it centers the anemone, but there's a recent novel by Rita Indiana in English translate. It exists in English translation. It's called Tentacle, and there an anemone actually plays a big role for time travel. But it's not really on the animal, but it does. But the ocean is quite important there, and there's really interesting work, I think, in general, if you look at Caribbean studies on the ocean weird, and how that becomes really important in contemporary literature. Um, and Thank you so much. Baptiste also mentioning work on microbes and shamanic being by Cesar Giraldo Herrera. And recommendations for the Andean region. I can't think of any right now because I'm not an expert on the Andean region, so I wouldn't be able to give you the best examples there, unfortunately, Laura.
Thanks, Sophie, for spending this 1 hour with us. It's been great to talk about these questions, but in a completely different context. And thanks, everyone, for joining us today.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you very much.